Welcome back to the Airplane Spoon podcast. Real questions and real stories about feeding children. I'm Serena Merle, feeding therapist and director of the Airplane Spoon. And today I want to talk to you about something that comes up for almost every family that I support. And honestly, I think it's one of the most misunderstood concepts. So here's the question. Is my child's growth percentile a problem? Or better yet, what does my child's growth chart even mean? If you've ever sat in a pediatrician's office and have your child weighed, and then you're waiting for that little dot to get plotted on a chart and hold your breath, where's it going to be? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? Is it concerning? Is it okay? This episode's for you. And I want us to think about growth charts as one tool, but not the only and definitive tool to try to measure a child's health. Health is a very, very complex concept, and we have lots of areas of health. We have physical health, which could be related to weight or nutrition or our bowel movements or sleeping and all of these other factors of our body. We have emotional health, and that could be our relationships and how safe and supported we are. And we have mental health and how, we are able to cope and to express our feelings. And we have cognitive health, our learning and our ability to problem solve and to advance in those next steps of learning topics. So health is very, very complex. It's really big. And if we're only thinking that a child is healthy based off of a dot of their weight, we're missing so much. A growth chart, which could be for weight or for height, and for babies, we're looking at head circumference, is one tool to track over time changes. But for many families, this misunderstanding and this over globalization of what this means leads to a lot of unnecessary worry and sometimes the opposite of reassuring that everything is okay is not happening. And I think we could do a better job at not only ourselves understanding what it means, but also advocating and supporting a full health picture for our children. So today I want to really help you understand what growth charts are, how they were designed and built, and what they're based off of, and what they can tell us, but more importantly, what they can't. So let's get into it. I want to start at the beginning and what physically is a growth chart actually showing us. A growth chart looks like a bunch of lines and boxes, and it has these lines in the middle that go up like a big wave or like a half of a rainbow. And those are called percentile lines. And they are usually at different divisions. So it might be like 5th and 10th and 25th and 50th, 75th, 90th, and 95th, something like that. But each chart is going to be compared to a sample of children that are the same age and the same sex at that point in time. So if your child is at the 50th percentile for weight at 1 year old, and he's a boy, then that means that out of 100 1-year-old boys, 50 of them are going to weigh more than he does, and 50 of them weigh less. He's right in the middle. And that's great. He's right in the middle. He's average. He's not on the much heavier side. He's not on the much lighter side. He's right in the middle. And if it was 25th percentile, what that means, let's say you have a 7-month-old girl and she gets plotted at the 25th percentile at that checkup. And so that means that of other 7-month-old girls, 75 of them are going to weigh more than her, and 25 of them are going to weigh less than her. She's actually still in the range of normal. She's just a little bit on the smaller side, but that might not be concerning, especially when we cross compare it to height, which often doesn't happen. When I have a parent come to me and they tell me that their child was weighed and that they're at the 10th percentile, and I ask them, what's their height? And their height wasn't measured. For some reason, a lot of times a child's height is only measured once or twice in a year after the first year. And their weight is measured a lot more frequently than that. But if I don't know if a child's height and weight are correlated, I don't have enough information. If this child is at the 10th percentile for weight for her age, but she's also at the 10th percentile for height, she's proportionate. She's a very shorter, smaller girl for her age. And so then, therefore, because she's smaller, she weighs less. That makes sense. We need to have more information to be able to understand what this means. Now, if we can think about height for a second, let's step out away from weight just for a minute. If you think about the general public, there are people that are much taller than you. And there are people that are much taller than everybody. Let's say there's this man who is, a whole head or two above everybody else. He is probably going to be at like the 98th, 99th percentile for height because there are very few people that are taller than him. He is taller than everybody else. So that's like the 98th, 99th percentile. And if there's a person that's very, very, very short, they might be at the 5th percentile for height, or the 10th percentile, or the 1st percentile for height. And there are not a lot of people who are shorter than that person, but there are a lot of people who are taller than that person. That would be a normal range, and there are outliers on both sides. But for the most part, if we look around, most people are within this range of height. And sex is going to be different. And also our cultural backgrounds, which I'm going to get into a little bit later, affects our genes and our height, which we don't have much control over. So that can make sense for height. But I want to talk about weight because we do have more influence over our weight. But I want to think about that there is no goal on this chart. The problem of this is because of tests. When we take a test, we want 100%. 100% is a perfect score. What did you get on your spelling test? What did you get on your math test? 100%. I knew all of the information. Great. But percentage is not the same thing as percentile. And because these words are so closely correlated, that's why people confuse them. They are not the same. A percentile is not a grade. It is a comparison to a bigger group. And so if we don't necessarily want 90th percentile for weight. That's really, really heavy unless their height is also at the 90th percentile. Then that would correlate. 90th percentile for height, 90th percentile for weight. They're a very big child for their age. Okay. We want to think about where a child is trending on their growth on their own line over time. That's going to be the most important thing to understand these charts. If your child is on the 10th percentile line, and every time you go in, they're on the 10th percentile line, and they just keep bumping up with age, that they're still on the 10th percentile line, they're not dropping, and they're not necessarily significantly jumping. Most of the time, we're more concerned about losing weight than gaining weight, especially on the lower end. But any big shifts is going to have an effect on the body. We want to see, is it trending upwards at a steady pace, or is it falling flat? And then we're going to start to lower our percentiles. So a child that's maybe at the 25th percentile, and then they're still the 25th percentile, and then they're at the 20th, and then they're at the 15th, and they're kind of falling in their percentiles, because that means they're not losing weight. They're just not gaining weight at a steady pace. This is very important to note. You can still gain weight and drop percentiles. Most children are going to continue to gain weight. It's just at what rate are they gaining weight? If it takes them, let's say, a month and they gain a pound, and then that happens for a few months, but then it takes them like 6 months before they gain another pound, then they've kind of slowed down. They're still gaining, it's just much slower. All right, we're going to get into that a little bit more, but the part of today's episode that I want to talk about that I think most families have never even heard about, and it's really important for understanding growth chart and its limitations, is what are the sample sizes based off of? And also, did you know that there are two main growth charts that are in use in the United States, but they are very different in how they were built and their design and their sample size? First, there's the CDC growth chart, which most of us in the United States have seen. The current version was released in the year 2000. So right now, it is 2026 when I'm recording this episode. It's already 26 years old. But it was built actually using data collected from American children between 1963 and 1994. So this is actually much older data than just the last 26 years. And it is what's called a reference chart, meaning it describes how children grew up during that period of time in the United States in those conditions. The second chart is the WHO, or the World Health Organization growth chart. This was released in 2006 by the World Health Organization, and this one is actually the standard, meaning it was built to describe how children should grow under optimal conditions. And the World Health Organization chart was based on data from children from 6 countries around the world: Brazil, Ghana, India, Norway, Oman, and the United States. These were healthy, breastfed children in good living conditions. But why do I highlight this healthy breastfed children? The majority of children that were part of the CDC growth chart sample were formula fed from the Midwest, Greater Ohio area, and predominantly white babies in the CDC growth chart sample. And if you're not part of that sample, if you're not formula feeding your child, if your child is not white, it might not be representative. In the United States, most pediatricians use the World Health Organization chart for children under 2, and then they switch over to the CDC chart for 2 and up. And many doctors don't even realize that this happens, if this is automatically part of their systems. And many parents and other providers don't realize that these two charts can produce meaningfully different percentile numbers for the exact same child and the exact same weigh ins and data points. So let me repeat this again and why it matters. The CDC chart was built largely on formula fed white American babies. And the World Health Organization chart was built on breastfed babies from multiple countries. Because breastfed and formula fed babies often grow at different rates in the first year, with breastfed babies sometimes they grow more slowly after the first few months. And it might look like they're falling off the chart, especially for using the CDC chart, which is formula fed, when in reality, they're growing exactly as expected for a breastfed child. And there's a very interesting study that was published in the medical journal of Pediatrics, and I want to read this to you. It says that the investigators examined 18,000 children based on their parent reports on their health, development, hospitalizations. And then they looked back at their weight to see whether the child was classified as what's called failure to thrive, which is a medical terminology which means that they're not growing or they're growing very, 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 very slowly, and it's concerning. And if this was on the World Health Organization chart, on the CDC chart, or on both charts. And what this study found is that the babies who were classified as underweight on the CDC growth chart, but not on the World Health Organization chart, were found to have 3 times more likely risk of adverse health and developmental outcomes compared to infants who were not underweight on either chart. But then they considered underweight on both charts, and there was a 7 times increase of the odds of having adverse outcomes. And so the World Health Organization chart may be missing infants at risk for poor outcomes related to poor nutrition than the CDC growth chart can detect. And this is controversial and this is challenging. What are we basing it off of? And is your child exclusively formula fed, exclusively breastfed, or combo? And can we compare them? But here's the bigger point, and it applies to many families. Growth charts were not built to represent every child. They reflect the populations that they were sampled in. And that means that children from different ethnic and genetic backgrounds may fall consistently lower or higher on these charts, not because something is wrong, but because their bodies might be built differently. And one of these examples that's really important is that there have been consistent research to show that South Asian babies and children, this includes children and families from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, they tend to actually be on the smaller than average size compared to the full US population comparison that the growth charts are normed on. This does not mean that their child is malnourished or undernourished. It simply reflects genetic differences in body size. And yet, many South Asian families, I have a lot of Indian families that I support, have sat in their pediatrician's offices and they're told that their child is underweight, that they're on the 5th percentile, the 1st percentile on their growth chart, when in fact their child might be growing exactly right for their genetics. And now there is Indian Academy of Pediatric growth charts designed specifically for children of Indian heritage, and researchers are continuing to advocate for more ethnically appropriate growth references across populations. But many pediatrician offices in the US are still using a one size fits all, and that's worth being aware of. The takeaway here is not that growth charts are useless. They're not, but they're a tool with a lot of limitations. And your child's growth chart is most meaningful when it's looked at alongside a full picture of who your child is. their genetics, their family history, their feeding history, their overall health and development. So let's talk about something that I hear constantly: percentile drops. And this is where there's a lot of parent anxiety. My baby was at the 80th percentile for her 2-month visit, and now she's at the 50th percentile. Our pediatrician is saying that we need to fortify her breast milk so she can jump back up. My son was at the 60th percentile, and now he's at the 40th. My doctor seems worried. So let's break this down. First, some percentile movement is completely normal, especially in the first 2 or 3 years of life. Children are growing really fast. They're growing really, really fast, and then it slows down. If you think about the size of a newborn and then compare them when they're 1 year old, it's like double the size, if not more. That's a lot of growth. And then you compare them to when they're 2 years old, it's a big growth. But if you look at a 4, a 5, or 6 year old, they're not doubling in their size. They slow down. And so their growth percentiles is going to slow down as well. Babies are born at a size that's influenced by their mother's body and the conditions of pregnancy. So sometimes children that are genetically going to be bigger, taller, or weigh more because of their genes might actually be small when they're born, and then they grow really fast because they couldn't grow that much maybe inside their mother's body. Um, but research shows that as many as 30% of typically developing children, they cross percentile lines in the first 2 years of life. This kind of movement is expected, especially early on. The thing that raises a concern is not a single percentile jump. It's by crossing them 2 or more, or significantly shift in the rate of growth over a shorter period of time, or consistently is trending more downwards. And especially if height is also trending that way, that's going to be more of a signal that maybe the calories, the nutrition is not keeping up with what the body needs, and the body's not growing as expected. And that's worth a conversation with your pediatrician. So again, what I said though, keeping in mind comparison of weight to height is very important. If a child is at the 10th percentile for height, they're a very small baby, and they're at the 80th percentile for weight, that's going to look very different on their body because they're very small than if they were at the 80th percentile for height, where they're tall and they weigh more. So comparing this is very important so we get a better picture. Now, one thing I want to talk about now is that what the growth chart can't tell us. And this section is really close to my heart because it gets at why I do this work. Growth charts can tell us about physical size. It cannot tell us how a child is experiencing their feeding and their eating. And this is when I see families fall through the cracks. A child could be at the 50th percentile, right in the normal range, and they could still be gagging or choking at every meal, eating only 2 or 3 or 4 foods and refusing everything else, missing whole food groups, crying every single time it's time to feed, whether that's at breast or bottle or with food, having a lot of anxiety or fear around being fed, and having meal times or feeding times be extremely stressful and exhausting and distressful for the whole family. And for years, families are told. The pediatrician looks at the growth chart and says, "Don't worry, the growth chart looks fine." But the growth chart was never measured designed to measure if a child is eating safely or if a child is comfortable or if a child has a variety of nutrition that their body needs, or whether mealtimes are peaceful. They're only measuring physical growth. And there are children whose growth chart numbers look a little bit low, but they might be having very positive experiences with feeding and meal times. And that's not a problem at all. And the pediatrician might be wanting to push. So I have two stories here. The first one is there was a family that I saw who contacted me for support for her child, and she had been to the pediatrician's office several visits, and every time the pediatrician's like, "Oh, he's growing. That's great. Oh, his growth looks good. It's great. His growth is good. Keep doing what you're doing." And when she reached out to me, she said, "What I'm doing to make sure he's growing is while he's sleeping, I have a syringe and I am dripping it in his mouth the whole night. So he's swallowing his milk or his formula with his saliva while he's sleeping so that he grows." He did not eat any food when he was awake. He refused all bottles. He refused all food when he was awake. So, great job. He's growing. Keep doing what you're doing. How is that healthy? How is that not concerning? And we're not getting a full picture. Is this because the pediatrician is not asking? Or is it because the families are not sharing? It could be both. But that growth chart does not paint a full picture of this child and where the challenge is. And another one I want to talk about is that I have had pediatricians refer babies to me for feeding support because of this. They were at the 70th percentile and now they're at the 50th percentile or the 40th percentile. And so they want to have them be boosted. They want to supplement their feeds and have more because they're concerned about this drop, which isn't a drop, it's just a kind of decrease in the rate of growth. You're still going. It's just kind of like imagine in a car, right? If you're going 50 miles an hour and now you're going 40 miles an hour, you're still going. You're just going a little bit slower. So that's what that drop was, is that he was growing a little bit slower. Makes a lot of sense. He was about 6 months old. So he's exploring a little bit more. He's moving around, trying to start to crawl. And typically babies will drop their growth because they're using their bodies a lot differently. And so this doctor recommended fortifying the breast milk that the mom was pumping and putting breast milk in the bottles. And then they wanted to add an extra scoop of a formula to get more calories in. And what happened? This baby developed reflux. He did not have reflux, but because of how dense his feeds, his bottles now were, if before they were like 100 calories for his bottle, and now you add an extra scoop and now they're 150 calories, that's a big jump for the stomach, and the stomach's going to shoot out more acid to try to compensate for all these extra calories. And he got reflux because the food was too dense. Imagine if you were to just eat like a plate of butter. You're going to have a lot of acid. You're going to feel super acidic because the stomach recognizes that this is super high calorie and shoots out more acid. And then the acid kind of comes up, but it makes you feel uncomfortable. Same thing. It was too calorically dense for his body, and his body was reacting because this doctor was concerned that he dropped from the 80th percentile to the 50th percentile. 50th percentile is right in the middle. Half the kids are bigger, half the kids are smaller. There's no concern. There's no concern with that. But this doctor had this response. And I want to say this, that while doctors need to measure weight and height, doctors might not have, and many of them don't have, much, if not any, training in feeding skills, nutritional skills. They're just plotting these data points. But what is the bigger picture about how much should they eat or over what time, or how do they make sure that they're comfortable and that this looks safe? That might not be part of that doctor's training. And then the best practice would be, if the doctor does not know or if there are concerns, to refer to a feeding therapist, which could be an SLP, a speech language pathologist like me, could be an occupational therapist. Sometimes referring to like lactation consultants or an IBCLC, board certified lactation consultant or lactation counselor. And they might be helpful to look at, the rate of the breast milk flow or the latch, but maybe there's other pieces there that aren't being captured. And a dietitian is going to understand if this is enough calories for this child to grow. But just putting more calories to grow doesn't mean it gets easier. We want to make sure that the experience is positive, not just for the child, but for the parents and the family as well. There can be a lot of stress around feeding children. And so, how can we make it easier? As a feeding therapist, I work with families and I'm looking at so much more than the growth chart. I'm asking, how does your child respond to food? What does it look like in the hard moments? Is there a variety, or is there safety and comfort and peace? And what do bowel movements look like? What does sleep look like? What does breathing look like? And all of those pieces I try to put together. So before I close, I want to give you a few practical things to take away that you can take with you to your next child's child checkup or pediatrician appointment, to ask about or to talk about, to see, is there different information that maybe could just help inform you more about your child's growth. The first one is to ask about the trajectory, not just the percentile. Asking, is this consistent with where they've been before? Or is this trend concerning, or are they following on their own curve? That's going to give you a really good information. If they're following on their own curve, that's great. That's the rate at which they're growing. And so we're trying to compare it to multiple data points, not just one. The second one is, you can share your family genetics or your health, your family kind of history around growth. Your child's growth chart is more meaningful when your pediatrician has a full picture. So, for example, in my case, my brother, he was at like the 99th percentile for height, and he was at a very high percentile for weight too. My mother's dad was a very tall man. He's like 6'10", and he was like 350 pounds. So there's a genetic component there, especially for the height, that was a factor, for example, with my brother's height and growth. So if you know that you and your partner's families are on the taller or larger side, that context could matter. Or if you're on the much shorter and smaller side, that could be very helpful. And especially if your family genetics and heritage might come from where bodies tend to be smaller, like South Asia or East Asia or others, it could be worth mentioning if your provider doesn't ask, and to see if there's a different growth chart that you can compare it to. Also, if feeding, and whether that's babies, breast or bottle, or children with food, if eating and feeding feel hard, you can bring it up with your pediatrician. If your child is only eating a handful of foods, if you feel very stressed or your child feels very uncomfortable or anxious, you can bring that up even if the growth chart looks fine. The growth numbers alone don't tell the full story, and then this could open up a conversation about possibly a feeding evaluation referral with a feeding therapist. And number 4, this is the most important one, is trust your instincts as a parent. You know your child. If something feels off, there's something off. That means it could be better. It's worth asking about, even if the chart says everything's fine. If you're being told that it all looks great, don't worry, and you're still worried, it's okay to ask for a second opinion. or to get a referral for a feeding therapist or a GI doctor or a dietitian or somebody else to take a look to see if there's factors that we're not catching just because the growth looks okay. Now, growth charts are a valuable tool, but they're just one tool. And they come with real limitations in terms of who they were built to represent and what they can actually measure about a child's health and well being. What I hope that you took away from today is that percentile is not a grade. The goal is not 100. Your child is not behind or concerning if they're at the 30th percentile or the 25th percentile, if they're growing steadily. And a normal growth chart does not automatically mean that everything is going well. Your child is a whole person, and understanding their growth means understanding the whole picture. If you have questions about your child's feeding, or if mealtimes feel stressful and you need support, then try to reach out to a local feeding therapist in your area, or I'd love to connect with you. You can visit me at theairplanespoon.com and we can talk some more. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to the Airplane Spoon podcast. Remember, you're doing an amazing job supporting your child on their feeding journey. You've got this. Love, eat, and enjoy.